If there's one thing I don't envy other creatives for, it's adaptations. Adaptations are hard. Creators having to juggle fan expectations, long-standing lore and mythos, and a deep understanding of the source material, all while creating something unique that stands on its own. And nothing gets it worse than comic book superheroes. Considering most heroes have been around for about 60 to 70 plus years, the multitude of different stories, continuities, and versions of these caped heroes far outweighs any other creative venture, especially when looking at the big three of the superhero world: Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man. Which is what makes Insomniac's take on the character so inspiring. Spidey's been adapted numerous times over the past 20 years, having live-action films from Sam Raimi, Mark Webb, and the MCU, as well as various animated shows, video games, and comics under his belt. Unlike previous Spidey games, Insomniac's freed their version of Spidey from pre-existing comic and film continuity, creating their own story and world to play in, choosing instead to pull from various Spider-Man iterations and stories before it to craft the ultimate Spider-Man experience. By fall 2018, there had been so many different takes on the character of Spider-Man. If you weren't a die-hard fan of the comics, it wouldn't be hard to get lost on which followed the character most accurately. In fact, I still remember when The Amazing Spider-Man released in summer 2012, there was a large faction of Spider-Man fans that thought it was Webb that came up with the idea of the web shooters. Some even thought that Gwen Stacy was a simple side character, and were enraged an entire movie was spent on her relationship with Peter over having him with his childhood best friends Harry Osborn and Mary Jane Watson. Insomniac's way forward was crafting their own version of the world and characters we know, using what's come before as a framework and building off it to fill out the gaps with their own creative flair. Modern mainstream Spidey stories, at least at the time of the first game's release, saw characters like Mary Jane Watson, Harry and Norman Osborn, and Aunt May as the mainstays of the Spider-Man universe, each being given a role to play, even if they weren't all physically active in the narrative. The relationship between Harry, Peter, and MJ felt like it was plucked right from the Raimi trilogy. Aunt May's role in Feast and Norman's campaign as mayor being influenced from various comic runs, and we also see influence from the Amazing Spider-Man films with how integral Oscorp and Osborn are to all the action. The shady dealings of the company and Osborn himself sparking what ultimately serves as Spidey's toughest challenge yet. Gameplay-wise, a hefty amount of web-based gadgets felt akin to the route being taken with the MCU's take on Spider-Man, and a certain black goop being an Oscorp experiment certainly feels similar to the origin of the symbiote in the Ultimate Comics. But combining different elements of various Spider-Man iterations isn't exactly unique. What was the way every character was situated to serve the story, every activity adding further context and consequence to the events of the main narrative. Even simple things like collectibles or the comedically charged J. Jonah Jameson podcast helped to fill out what happened just prior, as well as what happened in the years prior to the Fist takedown, with Jonah's ramblings serving as a means to recount past encounters between Spider-Man and some of his rogues, like Rhino and the Vulture. Something that helps build in-world tension between Spidey and his foes, outside our knowledge of their battles from other media. So, before we get more in depth with the role of in-game activities and the supporting cast, let's put some focus on the main man himself. The Spider-Man we control through the story starts in a vastly different place than we usually find Spidey at the beginning of his adventures. Not only are we skipping the origin, but the entirety of the awkward teen years. Already 24, Pete's been Spider-Man a whole 8 years, having spent most of this time in conflict with Wilson Fisk. Giving Spidey age and experience creates a much more tech-based hero, something that allows for a wider arsenal of gadgets and strays from the rather tame use of webs in prior Spidey settings. Past games limiting webbing to simply trap an enemy for a moment, for traversal, or even for heavy combat constructs. Still sort of curious where the idea for those ones came from. And having a tech-based Spider-Man meant having a tech-based Peter. And as we all know, the best Spider-Man stories go beyond just Spidey himself. The entire Raimi trilogy, the first Amazing Spider-Man, and his MCU trilogy always ensuring that Peter Parker remains at the heart of the story just as much as Spider-Man. Peter's tech skills place him right beside Otto Octavius, someone all Spidey fans know best as the villainous Doc Ock. And yet, Insomniac Spider-Man spends most of its outing with the pair working side by side, Otto being a mentor, friend, and even hero to Peter Parker. I'd even go so far as saying that Otto serves as a father figure. These two are close. They're constantly aiding and lifting each other up, taking care of each other. At various points through the game, Spidey will receive calls from Otto, Peter Parker being the first person he calls whenever he's excited about a breakthrough, making their inevitable confrontation all that more devastating for both of them. It's truly what Insomniac does best. Peter is tied to every antagonistic force plaguing New York City. Where many would have slipped, making this feel forced and poorly strewn together, Marvel's Spider-Man carefully crafts their narrative in a way that makes it all feel natural. Aunt May's work at Feast brings Peter into contact with Martin Lee, and branches a relationship of mutual respect and admiration. There's a much shorter span of time between Lee's villainous turn and Otto's, and yet, we feel the same longing to save Lee as we do Otto, if not more so. All the early interactions between Lee and Peter painting the image of a great and reputable man, connected by their love and respect for the city and May. And while he's yet to don the green garb of his comic counterpart, the relationship between Peter and Harry gives Peter a line to Norman Osborn, who still finds a way to play a rather villainous role through the story, setting up pretty early on the culmination of the Insomniac trilogy with the inevitable clash between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin. With a campaign ranging almost 30 plus hours in length, having the ability to witness the story as both Peter Parker and Spider-Man helped to truly flesh out this iteration of the character and make him his own. Something that helped to escalate the story of Spider-Man above that of the previous king of superhero gaming, the Batman Arkham series. While that Batman was ultimately his own character, there wasn't a lot about him that made it feel like he couldn't work interchangeably with his comic counterpart, with Arkham City being what really separated him from the comic iteration, taking him 2 whole games to get to where Peter is by the first act. Nothing about Insomniac Spidey feels like he can fit interchangeably with his comic counterpart, or a counterpart in any other form of media. A lot of influence may be drawn from previous Spider-Man iterations, but this version is distinctly his own. Perfectly crafted to fit the world, and defining a distinct style that makes him recognizable beyond his appearance in the game, something that's earned him a spot across various comics and films. And that's what matters most. Had all 3 live-action Spideys been handled the same, and given the exact same characteristics and feel, their coming together in No Way Home wouldn't have made us feel any real way. They all played the same character, but they brought something unique that made their interactions work. Insomniac taking the same approach to their Spidey will ensure he remains a large part of Spider-Man's stories and mythos well beyond the conclusion of their final Spider-Man story, something that even Arkham Batman has received of late. We went real in depth with Peter, but that's to be expected of the one bringing everything together. But I do briefly want to touch upon the allies of Spider-Man, and more so, how the role of every single Spidey character means something to the narrative that Insomniac crafted. I never gave much thought to it back in the day, but rewatching the original Spider-Man trilogy for this video made me realize how easily you could recap the entire trilogy without mention of half of Spidey's side cast. Realistically, outside of being the love interest that needs constant saving, Mary Jane serves almost no purpose to the greater story being told. In fact, the only characters who actually develop and remain important to the entire Raimi trilogy storyline are Peter, Harry, and Norman. While later films found improved roles for the supporting cast and love interests, at the time of this game's release, their handling of Spidey's sidecast was the best use of these characters through all of Spidey's mainstream, non-comic storylines. Aunt May's role at Feast builds the bridge between Peter and Martin Lee, giving us moments of Lee before the negative storyline takes hold, and causing us to share the same drive Pete has to reach him before it's too late. Beyond Lee's turn, May's continued role at the Feast Center serves as a means to keep Lee's legacy alive, reminding us of what he's created and the good he'd once done. With Feast being a sort of central hub for Spidey, May serves as a central pillar, connecting his allies and serving as a means for New York to come together during the Devil's Breath pandemic. Mary Jane truly serves as Spidey's partner through the Demon's conflict, even if he doesn't exactly see it at first. While Spidey's busy taking down supervillains, MJ serves as a point person, working to find the Devil's Breath and later its antidote. Beyond just the main story, MJ serves as a means to weave webs between the various side quests, like tearing down the demon warehouses to build a case against them, or even spotlighting Tombstone's involvement with Lee. Norman Osborn may not be the villainous Green Goblin just yet, but that doesn't keep him from the shady and villainous intent expected of Peter's greatest nemesis. Mayor Osborn serves as a central figure for the story, tying the villains together and giving Spidey reason to take on both Lee and Otto. Norman's quest to stop the villains himself and protect his secrets, namely the Devil's Breath lab, brings the mercenary group under Sable to New York. All this leading back to a much more potent plot point for Peter, Norman, and MJ. Harry Osborn isn't physically present in the first outing, his illness serving as Norman's motivation behind everything happening with the Devil's Breath. Not only does this tie up a perfect reason and sort of hard look at this version of Norman, it serves as a means for us to truly understand Norman's look on his family, and the love he has for his son, even if it does lead him to fill some rather nefarious shoes. Yuri Watanabe was the biggest surprise character for me. Spidey's ally in the NYPD, of course, having a major role to play between Kingpin's downfall, the rise of the demons, and the chaos brought about by the Sinister Six. Despite her large role through the main narrative, it was her conflict with Hammerhead and the Maggia crime family that really painted who Yuri is. There's not much I can truly say on Yuri, as outside comics, most mainstream Spidey fans likely weren't aware she existed. This being the case, it's impressive how she went from a character I'd never heard of to someone I cared for deeply. Again, having the same drive to aid her and pull her away from the darkness that makes her become the Wraith, as I did Lee in the main story. And of course, we have Jefferson Davis, an honest cop that works as a close ally to Spidey in the final few missions of Act 1. Like Yuri, there isn't too much I can say for Jeff. His interactions with Spidey makes us love the guy, and makes his death only a few missions later devastating. But it does pave the path for a major development in the Insomniac Spider-Man storyline. I still remember when the first gameplay trailer released, and the first glimpse of Miles blew up, many wondering how he'd fit into the story. Years later, and I feel a large majority sit in agreement that one of the best aspects of the game vs. Spider-Man story is the relationship being built between Peter Parker and Miles Morales. But before we jump into the days of this Venom-powered young spider hero, let's pop back to the beginning. Miles isn't properly introduced to us until the conclusion of the game's first act, but he's thrust deep into the conflict from there, particularly as the final act plunges the city into chaos, with Miles even getting up close and personal with the Rhino before his Spidey powers kick in. Miles had been around for a few years by this point, but at the time of the release, this served as a great introduction for mainstream fans to meet the character, as the first Spider-Verse movie was still a few months away. The name had definitely been familiar, and many were able to guess where the story would be heading for him. And while Miles isn't bit until the very end of the game, the qualities of Spider-Man are displayed throughout. Some being the typical trouble Spidey gets himself into, others being the bravery it takes to guide Aunt May out of a flaming building, or go toe-to-toe with inmates from Rikers for a complete stranger. What's most telling is a quick conversation between Pete and Miles following Lee's arrest, where Miles addresses his feelings on working at Feast following the reveal that Lee killed his father.
Oh, the people here, nothing Martin Lee did is their fault. They need help and I'm helping them. I think Dad will want me to stay. I think he'd be proud.
All of this paves the way to Miles' own story and his journey to find his own version of the web-based hero. The same heart he displays in the main story carrying into his spin-off, making beats like his conflict of ideals with Uncle Aaron and his battle against Finn Mason feel worthy of both the Miles Morales we met in Marvel's Spider-Man, as well as the brand new Spider-Man protecting New York. Where Peter's following the classic ideals of with great power comes great responsibility, Miles takes on his father's motto of a hero's just a guy who doesn't give up, refusing to back down against Roxxon, Tinker, or even his uncle. Miles never lets himself fall or surrender to the hardships, building on the type of man he can and will become. We're still pretty early into Miles' tenure as a hero. Out of universe, there's also not a lot of adaptations to work with, his two major mainstream appearances coming from this game and the Spider-Verse films. Seeing as both Marvel's Spider-Man and the Miles Morales spin-off serve as his origin story, I feel it'll be easier to discuss Miles in far more detail in the next few years, following tomorrow's release of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, and eventually the release of Beyond the Spider-Verse and Marvel's Spider-Man 3. No superhero story will ever be complete without its villains. And so, how do the villains and conflicts of Insomniac's two Spidey stories stand against their heroes? Again, a major point I have to give to Insomniac is how well they weave it all together. Past Spider-Man games have always been sort of notorious for jumping supervillain to supervillain, all while having a sort of overarching narrative in place. Some bosses serving no purpose to the actual story, though that doesn't stop them from creating an entire 40-minute sequence chasing down and beating comic villain F before proceeding to the next set of missions. Here, every villain has their place. Kingpin's defeat in the intro serving as the tipping point that brings Martin Lee and the Demons to New York in their all-out war against Norman. And by the time Spidey finally bests Lee, Otto's been inspired and ready to form the Sinister Six. Even the smaller encounters like Shocker and Tombstone tie deeply to the Demons' plotline, Shocker being blackmailed by the Demons, and Tombstone appearing on Spidey's radar following his building of Lee's massive tanker. There's not a single fight Spidey involves himself in that doesn't have ties to the plot. Even the general thugs plaguing the streets are said to be in response to the lack of control that Fisk once held over the city. I've talked a lot about the connections and story flow, but it's time to talk about our two big bads, Martin Lee and Otto Octavius, two men motivated by the downfall of Norman Osborn. Their hatred, one's justified and one's less so, being the reason behind all their destruction. And this is a major point I find overlooked between the two. While I would never go so far as to defend Lee's actions, as he's ultimately jeopardizing and harming far more innocent people, Norman's actions brought about the death of Lee's parents, at least helping us understand why Lee feels driven to the point he's now at, and how he fell down this path of revenge. Otto, however, is built off a grudge. Yes, Norman's a sack of shit, for lack of better words. He's clearly abusive and manipulative when it comes to his dealings with Otto Octavius and others, but Otto has no tragic background to his actions. He's merely a man that snapped after being burned one too many times. He may be justified in hating Norman, but his transformation into Doc Ock is far less understandable. Like Peter, we do care for Otto and we want to pull him back to his senses. And just as Peter realizes, we too see just how far gone Otto has become, a large part of that being derived from his lack of true hurt. After several replays, I've continued to see Lee as a tragic figure, but Otto, he's merely a man with a bruised ego. Now, I'm not leaving out our big bads from Miles Morales. Though Miles' first outing as Spider-Man saw him take on a few different adversaries, his biggest threats came in the form of the Prowler and the Tinkerer, the conflict between Aaron and Miles being what stuck out to me the most, serving as a polar opposite to the lesson Peter's uncle left him with. While Aaron does come from a place of love, wanting Miles to hang up the mask and stay away for his own safety, Aaron's ultimate lesson to his nephew is to sit back and do nothing. While he'd been sporting the red and black for some time now, it was the battle between Miles and Aaron where I felt Miles truly became Spider-Man. His decision to go against his uncle and refuse to sit back on the sidelines while the Underground and Roxxon tore New York apart serves as what ultimately sets him on the path of becoming his own hero, keeping true to his father and never allowing hardship to force him to the sidelines. Finn Mason's Tinkerer feels like a heavy cross of Otto Octavius and Martin Lee, her brother's death giving her actual hurt and reason to carry out her actions, but her more vicious and destructive persona and relationship to Miles feeling very Otto. She's also a tech genius, so they do have that in common. The battle between Spider-Man and the Tinkerer very heavily mirrors the battle between Spider-Man and Doc Ock, a battle where the hero has to protect a shady billionaire against someone that's been wronged by them, but ultimately is proving the more dangerous. I feel Miles' ability to actually bring Finn to her senses, even if it is only with enough time for her to fly him up and get herself blown up to save the city, shows the potential for Miles in the coming storyline, something we'll likely see with Miles and the symbiote-infested Peter. I know a lot of people want a Miles versus Peter fight, and it seems we may be getting it. Alright, one last talking point before we wrap things up here, and this should be quick as we've gone into it a bit already. Video games have an added advantage that movies, shows, and even comics don't have the luxury of: side content. Marvel's Spider-Man and Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales are littered with various activities, collectibles, side missions, and events that further build on the story, background, and lore of the world and characters. Harry's research station set up the type of relationship Peter and Harry shared, as well as how there was some tension between Harry and his father when it came to Harry's mother and her projects. Certain side objectives further illuminated the danger of the demons, like their attempt to assassinate members of Norman's campaign offices, and how the lasting effects of Lee's corruption abilities continued to plague the students of ESU. Other activities elaborate on the dangers left in Fisk's wake, including new villains taking to the streets, or even how Fisk himself continues to control elements of the city from his prison cell. I know people hated the MJ missions, but there's no denying that spending just a little bit of extra time exploring would reveal key bits of info about past relationships and events to occur in the world, including some tidbits about the relationship with Harry and the Osborns, and the various fights between Spider-Man and Kingpin prior to the game. Gang strongholds placed around the map served as a means for Spidey and his allies to learn more about their enemies' operations and build a case against the various factions plaguing their city. Collectibles like Peter's backpacks, Aaron's song samples, and stolen paintings from the original Black Cat all add to the world and help us discover who some of these characters are and what they've done. And the plethora of phone calls both Pete and Miles receive through their games can actually delve further into some of our favorites if you do stop and listen before starting your next mission. In case it hasn't been made evident from this entire video, what Insomniac nails in their take on Spider-Man is their ability to tie it all together. Every single activity, collectible, event, and character has a role to play in the overarching narrative, and each of their major 3 stories plays on themes that matter. With stories that matter, helmed by characters that matter to us, Insomniac has gone a long way with their take on the web-based Marvel hero, and have ultimately excelled in their adaptation of Spider-Man.